All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to, um, I'm just trying to make this adjustment here. We're back up on the stream. Um, Welcome to K Talk. Welcome to the stream. Welcome to Breaking Health Barriers with me, Dr. Jack Stockwell. I'll be here for a couple of hours with you. Several different topics to cover in the time allotted to us. And again, as you could hear there at the beginning, the scheduled programming there it's different from one day to the next, so it's not always for me to easy to coordinate this. So anyway, I'm happy here. I'm happy to be here. I several things I want to talk about. I want to talk about the Hantavirus, of course, so we can try to dispel some fears as to another big scam being, in the background. I also want to talk about the concept of a virus, and just it's going to be a bit of a repeat of what I talked about 6 years ago, when all the nonsense came out about COVID. And then I want to talk about briefly about Anthony Fauci, because there's just a couple of days left. Today may be the last day to prosecute Anthony Fauci for lying to Congress about the gain of function on COVID. Just a quick comment about that. And then a question about autism that medicine is continuing to refuse to answer. And then some interesting stuff. I was asked again about sugar substitutes. I don't know of any better sugar substitute, tell you the truth, than honey. So I've got some things to talk about honey in the sense of how honey is used around this planet, besides just for food. But is it a virus or is it a plague? That's how I want to start this program today, talking about hantavirus. Are we talking about a viral infection, or are we talking about the next plague? Because a mortality rate of 40 to 50%, as you see reported by the mainstream media, is about equivalent to one of the bubonic plagues. Bubonic plague, when it breaks out, it's about 40 to 50% mortality rate. So, hantavirus transmission to humans by rats also is the characteristic of the plague. The rat doesn't have the hantavirus. The hantavirus is in a tiny little bug that lives in the hair of the rat. And when rats get infected by what this little bug has to do, or a human does, because a human can be bitten by these tiny little fleas, you pick up something, in the case of bubonic plague, called Yersinia pestis. Yersinia pestis has the reputation of having killed more human beings on this planet than anything else, as far as living creatures are concerned. So the hantavirus is very similar to this, but back in 1998, I don't remember which episode of X-Files, but X-Files talked about the hantavirus in an episode that came out in 1998. And it was a staged viral infection. And who did the writers of that TV program, X-Files, blame the release of hantavirus on into the public? I know you probably don't know the answer, but it was FEMA. Back in 1998, X-Files had a whole program on the release of hantavirus, and they stopped it just in time, but it was FEMA that released it into the public. Now, wouldn't that be typical for a new outbreak? I mean, wouldn't that be just setting the stage? Because it's relatively easy now. This has been shown to us over and over again. It's very easy to release a saved virus from a lab targeting certain populations. And if it gets out of hand, then of course there are vaccines that are ready to go, like in the case of COVID. My understanding from what I've been able to gather so far, there's already 7 or 8 hantavirus vaccines ready to go the minute they're given the green flag. And so there are some bad-mouthing people who said that they recently had hantavirus simulations, pretty much along the lines of the COVID simulation that was given back in New York City in 2019. Excuse me. Under the auspices of Johns Hopkins University, where all the big players, the UN agencies, the financiers, and of course the vax czar, Bill Gates, participated. So this time, with such a high reported mortality rate, it might be very easy for the agents in charge, like FEMA, to get people to run to every source offering all the various mRNA vaccines, because the deadly mRNA is going to be sure this time the virus kills. So you're going to want to be sure to get your mRNA. So what is the background of this scaremongering story? Very much reminiscent of COVID. Well, there's a little boat out there floating in the water, like the Princess back in 2019. Now you have this Dutch-flagged cruise ship in the Atlantic, the MV Hondius, with 149 passengers, a smaller boat to be sure, with crew, left Ushuaia, which is located in Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, on the 1st of April, 2026. It is, the city is widely recognized as the southernmost city in our hemisphere. And on the ship's voyage north, 7 passengers fell ill and apparently 3 died. Now, the ship first stopped at St. Helena, where a Swiss passenger was evacuated, flown to Zurich. He is now, as of my latest recording here, hospitalized with symptoms of the hantavirus. Now, St. Helena, where the ship stopped, is a remote volcanic island located in the South Atlantic Ocean between the southwestern coast of Africa and South America. And at the next stop in Cape Verde, 3 more passengers were taken off the vessel. In the Canary Islands, more passengers were evacuated. And the sadly funny thing is that the British scientists, as they were called, probably in collaboration with the Western scientists familiar with gain of function, have been developing a vaccine since August 2023 against a hypothetical unknown pathogen that they referred to back then as Disease X. I remember talking about Disease X 2.5 years ago, saying, well, this is the next one, which experts fear could cause the next global pandemic. Now, how can you develop a vaccine against a disease that does not yet exist and is unknown? Leave it to our scientists to do that. Because maybe these visionary scientists knew that hantavirus would eventually hit humanity just about 3 years later, like 2026. So there was apparently no rat on the ship, according to the health experts. So how did the virus get on the ship? Now, the Associated Press had ostensibly learned from confidential Argentinian sources that they believe a Dutch couple contracted the virus while they were bird watching at a landfill at the first stop, the Ushuaia, before boarding the ship. Bird watching at a landfill with rats. So, alternatively, could it be that dare I say this, the virus was released from a lab, probably category 4, war biolab of the type at Fort Detrick, Maryland, from where previous viruses have escaped, according to some sources, including COVID. So the hantaviruses, the samples have escaped the lab before, back in 2011. More than 300 vials of hantavirus, hendravirus, lysavirus went missing from the Queensland Public Health Virology Lab in Australia. That was then. We do not seem to know what harm these escaped viruses caused, because that's back in 2011. Now, hantavirus comes in two strains. When they hit humans, they usually cause hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome or hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome. And they're named after the Hanta River in Korea, where scientists first found the pathogen when UN troops deployed along the banks and fell ill with the hemorrhagic fever form. So the European and Asian strains, the one with hemorrhagic fever that destroys the kidneys, kills less than 1%. The North American strains, called the Andes strain, which was the one they discovered on this HM Hondius ship, can kill up to 50% with an average fatality rate of 40%, which is the same range that bubonic plague kills if it's untreated. Now, the WHO says, World Health Organization, the WHO says, don't worry about it. The risks are far too low. Which is strange. After all, it was the WHO which blew COVID out of all reasonable proportions and made it, within days, one of the deadliest panics in recent history, or better known as a plandemic, as we are aware now that it was one big lie. And although the pandemic treaty was approved during the WHO's 2025 annual meeting, the Critical Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing Annex, the PABS, essential for the treaty's implementation, has yet to be approved. We know we haven't accepted it here in this country yet. How would you like the WHO to be responsible for all the programs in this country dealing with the next pandemic? So it's also not expected to pass the 79th World Assembly that's scheduled next week. Recent negotiations have failed to produce a consensus, prompting the member states to extend discussions beyond the original deadline of next week to have all these countries come and join the pandemic treaty. Now, might this be the reason why the WHO does not want to burn its credibility this time by screaming wolf again prematurely? I mean, surely there's not going to be a wolf, but that has not stopped the WHO in the past from spreading fear and terror. But perhaps the most plausible explanation so far for this potentially new global virus scam is that it serves as a distraction from the on and off war theater that we have going on in the Ukraine and in the Middle East. You know, both for the public on the one hand, Wall Street Stock Exchange, oil and gas trading on the other, where these long and short gambling processes just completely enrich the billionaires, while the rest of us daily earners get poorer. Which, of course, would make the commanders of the City of London and Wall Street very happy and perfectly fit into the global picture of the eternal dealmaker, wouldn't it? So it's just something to keep in mind. Now, I want to say a couple of things about viruses, because I want to keep the science of viruses in perspective. Now, the astronomers and the astrophysicists work with absolutely immense, mind-boggling numbers. Caleb A. Scharf, who's director of astrobiology at Columbia University, said this: On a finite world, a cosmic perspective isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. Consider that the distance between the Earth and the Sun is just short of 100 million miles. One of the nearest stars to Earth, Alpha Centauri, shimmers some 4.4 light years away. Put another way, if the distance from the Earth to the Sun were fixed at 1 inch, Earth's closest neighbor, Alpha Centauri, would be 4.5 miles away. Now just think about that for a second. Using your thumb and your forefinger, space out about 1 inch. And if your thumb was the sun and your finger was the Earth, our closest neighbor in space would be 4.5 miles away from the thumb. Now the Milky Way, which is our home galaxy, comprises something in the range of 200 to 300 billion stars. And it's nestled among another 2 trillion or so galaxies estimated to populate the observable universe, postulated to have a radius of 13.8 billion light years, which of course is the distance from the Big Bang. Now I want those numbers to sit on you for a second. Again, if your thumb was the sun and your finger 1 inch away was the Earth, the closest neighbor would be 4.5 miles away, as we are out on one of the outer arms, supposedly, of the Milky Way galaxy. The Milky Way galaxy being one of 2 trillion or more galaxies, has between 200 and 300 billion stars. So if we were to take the higher number and say 2 trillion galaxies, and let's say there's some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, so the average of 300 billion stars per 2 trillion galaxies. Right, now just try to grab a hold of that number for a minute. 300 billion times 2 trillion. How many zeros is that? Well, 2 trillion would be 9 zeros. And 300 billion would be, 12 plus 9. What's that come out to? 21 zeros, maybe? The figure that is ascribed by the most serious of our virologists say that just the quantity of viruses on this planet alone is 10 to the 31st power, 10 with 31 zeros, eclipses even the immense numbers of all the stars in the known universe. That's how small those little buggers are. 10 to the 31st power. That's just in the air. 10 to the 31st power in the sea. 10 to the 31st power in the land and the soil and the terrestrial world, as well as the water world. That means that there are potentially 5 to 10 million times more viruses on this earth than there are stars thought to exist in the observable universe. Now, science writer Carl Zimmer says this, quote, "If you were to stack one virus, and remember, you can't see viruses except on electron microscopes of immense power, immense magnification. If you were to take these viruses and to start stack them on one on top of another, you'd create a tower that would go past the moon, beyond the sun, beyond Alpha Centauri, out past the edge of the Milky Way, past neighboring galaxies, to reach a height of 200 million light years. And that would be the viruses on this planet. Now, I said all that to give you some appreciation for how small these little buggers are. Viruses have no cell nucleus. What is the job of the nucleic acids, DNA, RNA, in a cell? DNA is the blueprint that makes a heart cell, a heart cell, a liver cell, a liver cell, a kidney cell, a kidney cell, an ovary cell, an ovary cell. RNA is the messenger part. DNA stays tightly enclosed inside the nucleus. The examples I've used in the past is if you had a rather large water balloon representing the cell, imagine a golf ball inside that water balloon. That would be the nucleus. And inside that nucleus is the DNA that tells that cell what to do. But the DNA doesn't tell the cell directly. The DNA sends instructions with the RNA out of the cell wall, or out of the nucleus into the cell, where you've got all these little machines doing the work of that cell. Now, viruses don't have that. They have no cell nucleus. They have no DNA. They have no RNA. They're just enveloped in a protein structure that is not classified among the 5 kingdoms of living things. Bacteria do not include viruses. Fungi do not include viruses. Protists, plants, animals, archaea, none of these things classify a virus as a part of that definition. So the debate lingers, and the CDC says viruses aren't alive. They're non-living entities. So when you hear about a particular vaccine having live viruses, and a vaccine having attenuated viruses, and a vaccine having dead viruses, that's all a bunch of crap, because viruses aren't alive in the first place. So 2 virologists, Mark Van Regenmortel and Brian Mahey, said this in their publication. And this is what they're blaming the hantavirus on, this kind of a creature. A virus becomes part of a living system only after it has infected a host cell, and its genome becomes integrated with that of the cell. Viruses are replicated only through the metabolic activities of the infected cells, and they occupy a unique position in biology. They are non-living, infectious entities that can be said at best to lead a kind of borrowed life, because they have no life of themselves. They have no DNA, they have no RNA, yet they can infect a cell. Now, viruses exist at the edge of life, as these virologists say, because they do not themselves exhibit a life function. They replicate and mutate efficiently and quickly, enabling them to mutate effectively, to adapt to a new host. How do they replicate? How does a virus replicate if it has no DNA? How do the cells in your body replicate? How does a liver cell create a new cell? Through mitosis. So, their vast, diverse population numbers, viruses, outnumber every cellular form on this planet if you added them all up together. Every other form of life on a cellular level, viruses would outnumber them 10 to 1. So, how did they get to be so big and important? Well, when you have things like dengue viruses, Ebola virus, Marburg viruses, hantaviruses, HIV, influenza viruses, rotaviruses, Nipah viruses, Middle East respiratory syndrome coronaviruses, COVID viruses, it's easy to pick a reason for sickness and death when you're dealing with these kinds of numbers and the inability that we have of being able to control them. Now, there is another viewpoint on viruses, that there's something called exosomes. In other words, if you see an electron microscope picture of a so-called coronavirus, corona meaning crown, you see a picture of a coronavirus, you see this tiny little dot with this thing around the edge of it that looks like a crown. That's a coronavirus. If you look at an exosome, and an exosome is something that comes out of a dead or dying mammalian cell that just floods the tissues with these tiny little dots that look exactly like a coronavirus. So there's the one viewpoint that these viruses infect cells. There's another emerging viewpoint in virology that these things aren't infectious at all. They're messengers. They're messengers from dead and dying cells, warning. So it's left up to us to trust the virologists when they say this particular little tiny bug has caused this particular disease. But don't worry, we have this particular vaccine to protect you because we know these vaccines are safe and effective. And you don't have to worry about side effects, and you don't have to worry about whether they're effective or not because we've already deemed that they're safe and effective. What else could be causing hantavirus symptoms if it's not a hantavirus? What are the symptoms of hantavirus? Fever, headache. If you have the Asian version, you have hemorrhagic fever, especially with the kidneys, and it can kill your kidneys. Is there anything else that can cause kidney problems? Just keep that in mind. The Andes version, or the version that shows up in this hemisphere, is the pulmonary one, very similar to bubonic plague, where you get an infusion of fluid into the lungs, so you have severe respiratory problems, pneumonia follows, drowning in your own fluids of your lung is usually what kills you. Is there anything else that can cause fluid collection in the lungs besides the Andes version of the hantavirus? I think you get the point. The story that Thomas Cowan gives, I think it's a great story, is you are the world's greatest expert on dolphins. And you get this phone call from Baffin Bay, way up there on the northern shore of Alaska. It's so far north that in the summertime, the sun never goes below the horizon. In the wintertime, you can go 6 weeks without the sun ever coming above the horizon. I mean, it's up there. And so you get a call from some scientists in Baffin Bay, and they say, we have this terrible problem. We out here in the water, we have all these dead and dying porpoises, dolphins. Dolphins and porpoises are not the same thing. We have all these dead and dying dolphins. We need some help. So you pack a suitcase and take, a day and a half to get there practically. You got to fly to Seattle, then you got to fly to Anchorage, and then you got to fly to Baffin. And remember, Alaska is so big that if you cut Alaska in half, Texas would be the third largest state. So you finally get to Baffin Bay, and here's these dead dolphins that have been collected. Some of them are still washing up on the shoreline. And you do some studies, some post-mortem studies on these dolphins. And there's no bugs in the blood. There's no viruses to see. There's no bacteria to see. There's no fungus to see. Yet you got all these dead and dying dolphins. And so someone is saying, well, we need to identify what kind of virus or bacteria are killing these things so we can vaccinate the living ones to prevent them from dying. But you can't find any bacteria. You can't find any virus. So it devolves upon you, as the world's greatest expert in dolphins, to come up with the next question. And the question is, all right, who's been crapping in the water? Oh, Dr. Smith, we did have an oil spill here a couple of months ago. It was pretty bad, but we thought we cleaned it up. Well, you mean something else besides a virus or besides a bacteria killed these dolphins? Well, when you have an oil spill, you don't get it all. And the oil, because you don't get it all, can poison various life forms, including the smaller fish that dolphins eat. And so dolphins start eating petroleum poisoned or petroleum distillate or petroleum product poisoned fish. The dolphins eat them, the dolphins die. There was no virus in the first place, except the normal viruses that you see everywhere. I think you get my drift. I don't think I need to go any further than that. And when you find out that they have been developing a Hantavirus vaccine since 2023, and here it is 3 years later, Hantavirus is showing up, and now they're finding more people infected with it. The thing I always try to say, I don't always remember, but the thing I always try to say at the end of my programs, keep your wits about you. One of my favorite lines from Braveheart, keep your wits about you. Because something tragic, as a seeming viral or bacterial death, might actually have been caused by something else. And just because there was a certain population of viral elements that may not be anything more than exosomes, or a growing number of bacteria because the immune system in the infected person is so weak, it allowed an overgrowth of this bacteria at the time of death, got blamed for the cause of death. And all these things are manipulated and controlled by big pharma, every bit as much as the computer chip in your car controls how your car works. Now, I'm going to try to stay away from the politics end of this. Which brings me to a quick report on Anthony Fauci. You remember Fauci's criminal activities that may have resulted in the millions of casualties. Rob Finnerty at Newsmax just put out one of the most urgent deadlines in American justice, that Fauci has just a few days left before the 5-year statute of limitations expires on his perjury before Congress. On May 11th, 2021, Fauci testified under oath, quote, "The NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology." That statement was made exactly 5 years ago, plus 2 days. And under USC 1001, false statements to Congress, federal prosecutors have until, it's already passed, May 11th to bring charges. After that, he walks free forever on this felony, no matter how much evidence piles up. Now, Senator Rand Paul, I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on this and get to other topics, one of which is, how do you protect yourself from viral infections? Rand Paul has already referred to the Department of Justice, Fauci, multiple times for at least 2 clear federal felonies. Number 1, lying to Congress. And the core allegation is that Fauci's sworn denial of funding gain-of-function research in Wuhan was materially false. The NIH-granted EcoHealth Alliance sent hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars to the Wuhan Institute of Virology for bat coronavirus experiments that created chimeric viruses, exactly the definition of gain-of-function that Fauci denied under oath. The internal NIH emails and grant documents released years later make this denial impossible to defend. And number 2, destruction of federal records and directing others to destroy records. So Fauci and top aides repeatedly instructed colleagues to delete emails after reading them to evade Freedom of Information Act requests and congressional oversight. A top Fauci advisor has already been indicted on related charges, and Senator Rand Paul said this: Fauci did all 3, lying, destroying records, and advising destruction. These are not fringe theories. These are documented criminal referrals from a sitting U.S. senator backed by emails, grants, and congressional investigations. So, beyond the perjury and records violations, in this interview, the 4 mechanisms through which Fauci's actions appeared to have caused millions of American casualties is the funding of gain-of-function experiments at the Wuhan lab, suppression of early treatment protocols. Remember how much he just ranted and raved against hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, how he instituted deadly hospital protocols like remdesivir and mechanical ventilation on people who should not get mechanical ventilation. And then, of course, the experimental mRNA injection mandates. And according to the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, it's resulted in over 1 million deaths, disabilities, and injuries. Fauci and public health officials also used artificially inflated COVID-19 case counts to manufacture fear, justify lockdowns, school closures, and the entire vaccine mandate regime that devastated families and, of course, the economy. And a recent German study found that 86% of PCR positive cases had no antibodies, yet they were still listed as positive. So what the Americans would like right now is some justice, not just another hearing. We are exhausted by endless hearings and no consequences, Epstein file being another case in hand. Countless hearings, no consequences. Countless crimes, no prosecution. So, there are a lot of families who lost loved ones because of Fauci's policies. And the millions who are still alive who've been injured deserve a lot better. And if he gets away with this, and I haven't seen the latest because I think the 11th, I thought today was a deadline. Turns out the 11th was the deadline. If he walks, pandemic reprise. Will it be the Hantavirus? I surely hope not. So, a couple of good friends that are patients in the office the other day for a heart sound recorder. Very interesting indication from the heart sound recorder that we got, suggesting some things he might do to strengthen his heart. And I was trying to find out what else they were taking. And they're taking the 636 formula, something I put together 20 years ago. It involves calcium lactate, involves cataplex C, and involves cataplex F. 3 very powerful additions to your immune protocol to build the immune system. As we know, the number one cause of cancer is a sluggish immune system. You can say that with almost any other disease process. However, the underlying cause of what leads to the disease, in my opinion, 90% of the time, is malnutrition. And because of the malnutrition, the tissues, whether it's heart, brain, gut, whatever, get sicker and sicker because it's not being fed the food it needs. And nature's cleanup crew, bacteria, show up to clean up the dying tissue. Every bit as much as flies and rats show up to clean up the garbage or to clean up dead and dying tissue on a macro scale. On a micro scale, you're going to have a proliferation of viruses as exosomes from the dead and dying tissues, as well as the bacteria that shows up to clean it up. It just isn't that difficult to get your way around this and through this. All right, that's enough for that. We're coming up towards the end of the first hour. All right, a couple of things about autism that I want to talk about for a moment. I haven't talked about autism in a long time. But how do you protect yourself from a virus? As I was saying with these friends of mine, 636. Again, it's a combination of cataplex F, of calcium lactate. Your immune system simply will not work without calcium. I can't think of one system in the human body that isn't to some degree or another calcium dependent. And the immune system certainly is, as well as vitamin C, which you have in cataplex C. And cataplex F, that drives the calcium out of the bloodstream deep into the tissues where the immune system is waiting for it. If you go to forbiddendoctor.com, under education to the podcast, and just type in 636, there should be 2 or 3 well-constructed podcasts to address that very subject. I take my calcium, my cataplex F, my cataplex C every day. I can't afford to be sick. I can't. At 75, I feel like I'm still going 100 miles an hour. I run up, I hit the wall. I hit the wall every day. I do. And I blame that on my advanced age. But I hit the wall, then I rest. I try to get a nap every day. I try to drink plenty of water so that I can finish off the afternoon. But I've got a full schedule today. I think I've got 4 new patients today. I saw a brand new one yesterday, sweet little 79-year-old lady, all bent over on the top half of her body. And she was drug in there by her daughter. And her daughter came because of some friends that we had taken care of that she was related to, that said, well, go see Stockwell. He might be able to straighten her up a little bit. So when you see a 79-year-old woman that's kind of hunched over, you figure, well, that's the way she's going to stay. No, not necessarily at all. She was definitely straighter, stood up more upright, and her right leg pain was gone when she left. If you go after the thing that's causing the hunching over, if you go after the thing that's causing the hump there at the top of the spine, at the bottom of the neck, it's easy to fix. So I would say she straightened up 75 to 80% improvement over when she came in. I'm going to see her 2 or 3 times between now and the end of the month. and she should be straighter by then. So I just want to mention that. But you got to make an appointment. You can't just walk in, or you can walk in and make an appointment by calling 801-523-1890. 801-523-1890. We can sit down and talk about it. You decide you don't want to do it, fine. There's no charge at that point. So like I said, I got 4 new people today because of 1 this morning, but 3 this afternoon, a mother and 2 children. I don't know their histories. I don't know why they're coming in. But the kids are old enough to be involved in sports, so I bet that's got something to do with it. Like this little 11-year-old girl. I've been taking care of her, I think, since she was 3 or 4. And she's really heavy into soccer. She's a goalie. And she was in the other day, Monday or Tuesday, Monday, I think, because of some back pain because of the way she jumped to stop a score. And the ball hit her pretty hard. I guess that goes with being a goalie. And I worked on her, and she stood up, and her pain was completely gone. I said, I would stay off the pitch for a couple of days if I were you. All right, now I want to talk about autism. I don't know if there's going to be a break or not, maybe at the top of the hour. But I hope I'm getting across to you. I hope you're getting something out of this. That there's some information that's worth listening to. Now, autism is now estimated at 1 in 31 8-year-old children. 1 in 31. About 3 decades ago, it was 1 in 10,000. Now it's 1 in 31. I need to tell you about this little autistic boy I take care of from Utah Valley. I think I've been working on him for 3 years. 3 years ago, just completely out of control. The only way I could get x-rays on him was for his parents to hold his head still, which he fought. Screaming, crying, punching himself in the face, banging his head on the floor, banging his head on the wall, hitting and kicking other people. When he was there Monday afternoon, I was absolutely floored by what his parents had to say. Those of you, they're LDS, and those of you who are LDS, in sacrament meetings, you know about the blessing on the bread and the water. And the priests up in the front of the congregation blessing the bread and water before it's passed to the membership. And when they went to bless the bread, he sat there with his arms folded, his head bowed, reciting out loud the blessing on the bread. Everybody's jaw dropped to hear what he was doing. So they couldn't wait to tell me about this experience when they got to the office Monday. And he now calls me Dr. Jack. After I work on him, he says, "Thank you, Dr. Jack." He's still autistic, but he's communicating. And his parents just absolutely thrilled over this. 2 things. He had a terrible misalignment that I have kept pretty much under control for the last 3 years, so the nerve tissue can heal, and major dietary changes on the part of the parents feeding him. Now, where did vaccination and autism relationship originally come from? Do you remember the doctor, the English doctor? RFK Jr. told Tucker Carlson that the CDC buried its own internal study showing 1,135% 1,135% increase in autism risk from the Hep B vaccination. The researchers were shocked when this happened, so they covered it up. What should we do with those researchers at the CDC who, when they discovered this, covered it up years and years ago so that they continued to give the Hep B shot? You know, it's been stopped now. Thank you, Bobby Kennedy Jr. We're just sitting here waiting to watch the autism numbers drop like a rock. So they covered it up. Well, how did they cover it up? They got in the study, what Kennedy told Tucker was that they got rid of all the older children in the study. So essentially all they had were younger children who were too young to be diagnosed. So imagine discovering evidence of catastrophic harm and making sure nobody found out about it. In fact, you're telling everybody it's safe. Now, if health authorities are willing to keep a signal, this alarming 1,135% increase in autism among those who got the Hep B shot, what else are they not telling you about vaccines? I mean, is it possible that your child's allergies, their asthma, their skin problems, their chronic immune problems didn't happen organically? They were as a result of the side effects of a vaccine. Now, the vaccine autism fight is usually framed as one bad paper versus settled science. Hands down, no questions. The framing is just too emotionally powerful and far too small, because the question is not whether a single case proved causation. It's whether or not modern medicine has built a system that can even detect rare subgroup-specific neurological injuries brought on by a chemical agent. And if it can detect it, is the system capable of admitting it? So, before you go digging into the evidence, I need to get this back up here. One thing needs to be understood. The official public health position from the FDA, the CDC, is that vaccines have not been shown to cause autism. Well, that doesn't end the discussion, not even close. It actually narrows the real question: are there vulnerable subgroups? Are there injury patterns or mechanisms that the broad population studies just aren't designed to see? Because if your study is not designed to see something, how can you ever expect to see it? See, this is part of the problems with the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. You can't do research now without an IRB study. The IRB study is people removed from the study look at your study outline to decide whether it can hurt somebody, whether it's a reasonably constructed study. Is there anything to be obtained from this study that's worth what it's going to cost to do? But mostly, is there any harm that could result from this study? And all they have to say, yeah, here's the problem. You want to study this vaccine and you want a control group who don't get the vaccine. So we're going to take 100 of these kids, give them the vaccine, 100 of these kids that won't get the vaccine, and we'll set it up in a randomized, placebo-controlled, double-blind, crossover study so that the people administering whatever else do not know who is what. Except at the very end, the bean counters will sit there and make some sense out of the study. And the Institutional Review Board will say, no, you can't do that. That you can't take 100 kids who should be vaccinated and not vaccinate them. That would harm them. Oh, the politics goes deep. But the prevalence problem is real because autism rose from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 31 today. Now, that doesn't mean that there's a cause. You would assume there is. It just raises questions that haven't been answered. What happened to cause something so dramatically increased in such a short period of time? What happened? Now, well, we've got better diagnosis. People are better trained to recognize autism. Have you ever seen an autistic child? Even light cases, low-grade autism, fully functional autistic people. If you sit there and talk to them for 5 minutes, you know there's something going on there that's not normal. Even though they appear to be very functional, all the way to the other end, where there's no self-awareness. They're simply not even aware that they're a human being. So that's what we call the autism spectrum, from one end to the other. And so what has happened? Well, we can diagnose it better now because we have better trained people to recognize. I know it when I saw it. I know it when I see it. Well, broader criteria. Here are things that we're considering autistic now that wasn't autistic 10 years ago. We didn't consider this behavioral pattern with OCD. We didn't really consider that as autism before. Now we recognize it as probably contributing to that problem. And then environmental exposure. The FDA has recognized over 50,000 chemical elements in our environment that we're constantly being exposed to. Whatever it is, you can't just wave it away. So why do vaccines cause autism? Well, the official narrative often collapses the entire debate into one man. Remember the English gastroenterologist, Andrew Wakefield, who was publicly crucified for a paper he published in 1998. It became the symbol of this whole debate before it was fully retracted in 2010. But the original controversy wasn't simply one man claims vaccines cause autism. Of course, that was the front page news. That's not what happened at all. It was real children experiencing real developmental regression, gastrointestinal disease, and a cry from parents to look into it further. That's all it was. A paper that was put together on these children who were suddenly regressing in their normal cognitive development. They were becoming autistic, in other words. They had severe gastrointestinal problems. And the parents said, we're just not going to sit by and watch something at these levels that up to this point is somewhat unknown. Now, here is the name of the paper that Wakefield published. Ileal lymphoid nodular hyperplasia, nonspecific colitis, and pervasive developmental disorder in children. Ileal lymphoid in the ileum, that's the last section of your small intestine. You have lymphoidal tissue in there. You have lymph nodes, which is why ileal lymphoid nodule. You have lymph nodes throughout your entire body. Your lymph nodes are the police station of your immune system. You have them in your neck, your throat, you have them in your groin, you have them everywhere in your body. And hyperplasia means overgrowth. That's all. So what are they saying? We saw overgrowth of these lymph nodes in the ileum. How did they look at the ileum? They did biopsies. Also, non-specific colitis. Some of these children had colitis, but not of a specific form. Colitis, meaning irritation, inflammation of the colon. And pervasive developmental disorder in children. That's the name of the paper. Now, the methods, you always want to look at the methods if you're going to judge a study, because you want to make sure they're not pulling the wool over somebody's eyes. The method, 12 children were referred to a pediatric gastroenterology unit with a history of normal development followed by a loss of acquired skills, including language, together with diarrhea and abdominal pain. In other words, there were these 12 kids. They all ended up in the same pediatric gastroenterology unit in a hospital in England, and they all were showing loss of acquired skills, including the ability to talk, together with diarrhea and abdominal pain. So they underwent gastroenterological, neurological, developmental assessment studies, and review of developmental records, ileocolonoscopy and biopsy sampling, magnetic resonance imaging, MRIs, and electroencephalography, checking brain function, lumbar punction, done under sedation, of course, looking for some infectious agent inside the cerebral spinal fluid. Barium follow-through radiography was done where possible. In other words, it was x-rays with an agent, a radiographic agent. And then biochemical, hematological, immunological profiles were examined. What did they find? This is from the paper. Onset of behavioral symptoms associated by the parents with measles, mumps, and rubella vaccination in 8 of the 12 children, with measles infection in one child, otitis media in the other, middle ear infections, what that is. Let me go through that again. What did we find? We found behavioral symptoms showing up that weren't there before. And what do we know about these children? In 8 of the 12, they had an MMR shot. Does that mean the MMR caused this? No. You can't say that. You can say it looks like it, but you can't say it did, because deeper additional studies are definitely required for that to be the case. But it's interesting that 8 of these 12 children had the MMR. All 12 children had intestinal abnormalities ranging from this lymphoid nodular hyperplasia, swelling of the lymph nodes. Tissue studies showed patchy chronic inflammation in the colon in 11 of these kids. Behavioral disorders, including autism, is in 9 of them. Disintegrative psychosis, that's even worse, in 1 of them. And possible post-viral or vaccinal encephalitis in 2 of them. Brain infection. That's why they did the lumbar puncture. There were no focal neurological abnormalities. In other words, the MMR, the MRI, and the EEG tests were normal. Abnormal laboratory results significantly raised heavily raised methylmalonic acid in their urine, and low hemoglobin in 4 of the children, and low serum IgA4 in 4 of the children. In other words, their immune systems were having problems. And then the interpretation. We identified associated gastrointestinal disease and developmental regression in a group of previously normal children, which was generally associated in time with possible environmental triggers. That distinction matters because a case series can be weak evidence for causation, but still point to a biological pattern worth studying. And that's all they said. This is what medicine is supposed to be doing constantly, especially with your tax dollars at the CDC and the FDA. Observe something going on, define the phenotype. In other words, what is this? Ask what kind of a mechanism could possibly explain it, and then test the model. That's what you do in a science environment. So why didn't that happen? Why did this topic become so uniquely radioactive? And that radioactivity has persisted ever since 1998. I mean, I think some people listening to what I'm saying right now will react as though just talking about this and asking basic questions is absurd and dangerous. Well, it's not organic. But buried, for decades, the vaccine autism debate was framed as settled science. I remember talking to a niece of mine who's a nurse about this some years ago. And somehow the discussion of some autistic child in the family came up, my extended family. And I said, did they get the MMR shot? I shouldn't have said that. Well, there's old Uncle Jack, the pseudo doctor. And my nurse niece said, oh, that's been settled. That was debunked a long time ago. But buried underneath that slogan of settled science are these unanswered signals. And the deeper you go, the stranger this whole story becomes. Because before the internet era, televised news sometimes would air these hard segments on vaccine injuries. Back in '78, the swine flu injuries. 1982, the DPT brain injury reporting. And other stories that would trigger instant reputational warfare. As the pharmaceutical industry came out and said, no, that's not true, that's not true. But the media environment changed once pharmaceutical advertising became embedded in broadcast economics. When I turned my TV on this morning, after I got out of bed, because I wanted to see what the weather, are we going to have another hot day? When's it going to start to cool off? Is there any rain in the forecast? There were 3 drug commercials before the weather report. Now, you can't prove everything in just one big leap. It's about narrowing the target and looking at the signal itself. Because when an injury pattern starts showing up and it becomes unspeakable, well, we're not going to talk about that. Oh, it's been debunked. Then the search for the mechanism that's causing it can disappear before it ever starts. So one proposed mechanism as to how the MMR causes vaccine is inflammation. Because inflammatory markers are very high in autistic children. And the immune activating events during the very sensitive development of brain tissue and brain function can produce brain or gut inflammation in susceptible children, which doesn't mean every child has the same risk by any means. But it means that the wrong biological signal at the wrong time in the wrong host definitely could matter. Why is it for some things society understands that not every child is identical? And when it comes to others, it's common to hear statements like, well, I was vaccinated and I'm just fine. Surely you have members of your family that say that following the COVID vaccine. What are you so worried about, Barb? I got the shot and I'm fine. The strongest version of the inflammatory argument regarding autism is not that autism equals inflammation or that all inflammation causes autism. It's more specific than that. Because some children show regressive onset. Right from the time they got the shot, there are mothers who are saying he's not the same. Within 2 days, he began to change. And then immune abnormalities start showing up. Immune problems they never had before. Gastrointestinal symptoms. All of a sudden, severe diarrhea or severe constipation. All of a sudden, there are foods he can't eat without getting violently sick. So the right question isn't to ridicule the person who asks it. We're just simply supposed to listen to the signal and try to find out where that signal is coming from. And so the most useful model is the toxicity bell curve. But in real life, things that harm us don't appear evenly among the population, whether it's a vaccine or a toxin that the local chemical company leaked into the water, some chromium problem, or a medication, or an allergen. Most people have no obvious reaction, while some have these little significant changes. Only a small group ends up with severe injury, but the most visible cases are the only ones that become significant. Now, you know what a bell curve is. Starts out down at 0, goes up into this high bell-shaped design, comes back down the other side. Well, those in the middle of that bell curve would be those who have a moderate reaction. And it's hard to typify what that is. It's way out on the far ends of the bell curve where there's significant reactions in a smaller, more focused portion of the population that starts to get some attention. But everybody in that bell curve could be having some kind of a reaction. And one of the most unsettling parts of this entire debate is that both sides may be talking about completely different populations. Because if neurological injury exists on a spectrum, from the very severe to the hardly noticeable, then the subtle cases could disappear in statistics, while only the real catastrophic cases become visible enough to fight over. So the bell curve is why most kids are fine. Well, my child got the MMR, he's just fine. And why some children may be vulnerable are not mutually exclusive claims. You can't say most children are okay, according to this bell curve study, and some children may be vulnerable. You have to deal with both of these. Drug safety works this way. Infection risk works this way. Environmental toxicology works this way. So a population average can absolutely hide a subgroup that should be seen. And the challenge is finding the subgroup before that harm becomes irreversible. And the additional challenge is to trust the system not to cover it up. Then besides inflammation, the second mechanism is the cell danger response. In simple terms, cells under threat shift from normal infection into a defense mode. And the mitochondria help coordinate that shift. In the healthy version, the cycle resolves itself, and then the patient's okay. But in the chronic version, where there is chronic cell danger, cells get stuck in a protective state that starts looking like some kind of a disease or some kind of a disorder. And this gives the vaccine autism hypothesis a broader logic in the sense that the trigger may not need to break the brain in one dramatic event. There are those who describe one dramatic event, like this lady I mentioned earlier. One day he was fine, 2 days after his MMR, he wasn't fine. Usually it's a slower onset than that. So you get a hyperimmune activation, altered metabolism, mitochondrial dysfunction, autoimmunity starts showing up, gut disturbances, neurological symptoms start reinforcing one another. And in most cases, it's kind of a slow onset, but where you have a healthy child, and 6 months later, they're deep in the autism spectrum. So the debate changes once you stop arguing over slogans. Oh, the debate's been settled. Oh, that was debunked years ago. And start asking real questions. Is there an inflammatory process going on in this child? Is there a gut injury? What are the cytokines doing? Is there cell danger signaling through cytokine? Is there a disruption in blood flow? The real divide is whether these patterns deserve deeper investigation, or do you just throw it out and just dismiss the whole thing? There are other causes. One of the most concerning patterns in the debate is how often parents describe the same sequence. I've talked to parents about this. You know, I don't want to hurt anybody, and I'm not judging anybody, because we're all just doing the best we can with what we have. But I've seen a mother's personality completely change once she finally realizes what's happened as a result of the vaccinations. And it's kind of a mixture of shock and anger at the medical professionals that talked her into it, anger at herself for not investigating it because someone told her, take a look at this before you do it. Because they all seem to chart out the same sequence of events. The child was experiencing normal development. Their eyes were fine. The shape of their face, their mouth was fine. They were learning a bigger vocabulary. They were starting to be more conversant. They were starting to mature. They were starting to take on a distinct personality, different than their symptoms. And then they got a vaccination. And then rapid regression started shortly after. Now here's the catch, and what most people miss. Autism isn't just one thing. Autism spectrum disorder includes children needing lifelong full-time care and people on the other end who are socially atypical but highly functional. And that ambiguity changes the politics. I have one family I take care of. My goodness, this must be 10 years ago, at least. With an autistic son, 18 or 19. Dating an autistic girl of the same age. And they desperately want to be married. And of course, this creates a whole new conundrum in both families, because the two seem deeply in love. And they want to get married and they want to go off on their own. So in talking to the mother, I said, you understand, I'm not an autism doctor. My job is the human nervous system. And obviously autism is a serious nerve disorder. And that's why I take care of autistic people. structurally as well as nutritionally, with usually pretty good positive outcomes. But let me ask you this about your son. Is he capable of living on his own? Is he capable of having a job, having a car, having an apartment, and living on his own without you being constantly involved in his daily welfare? Yeah, he's been doing that for about a year now. What about his intended bride? Well, she's working too, but she lives at home. Then what's the worst that could happen here? Are they in love? So you've got the full-time care on the one end where it is just absolutely heartbreaking. It's caused divorces, family breakup, family bankruptcies in the worst cases. And one family brought in a little boy, one of the worst cases. I mean, it was so bad. He had to wear diapers, and when he had a bowel movement, he'd reach in the diaper and grab his feces and throw it around the room, banging his head on the floor so that he was bruised. Had to wear a helmet because CPS thought that there was abuse going on. I mean, it's just, you just burst into tears. And on the other end, here's this couple that wants to get married. But they had the same onset, the same inflammation that became, their cognizance became regressive. Certain things were done in a certain amount of time. I've always told patients who've asked for my impressions in this matter, we think there might be a problem. He got a shot. Well, for Pete's sake, this is what you have to do immediately. And I suggested a couple books that they read. But the diet, you have got to get everything out of that child's diet immediately that Mother Nature didn't make, and make it organic. Because did the shot cause it? Or did the shot trigger it, but there's other underlying causes, like all the environmental poisons that are out there? Because there's kids with autism who didn't get the MMR shot. And yet there's populations like the Amish community who have no autism whatsoever. But look at their diet. Yeah, they don't get shots, that's true. But look at their diet. From the earth, from Mother Nature. I went into this a little bit further than I wanted to. Severe cases are easy to see. You can't miss them. Subtle cases are easy to miss. But if a child has a minor cranial nerve problem, the cranial nerves, there's 3 cranial nerves that control the eyes. Is there something going on with that eye that doesn't look normal? Does one corner of the mouth start to drop a little bit? Does one side of the face look a little asymmetrical compared to the other side of the face? There, we've just covered cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, and 7. Is there disruption in their sleep? Are there foods they refuse to eat anymore? Is there some delay in the development of speech? Is their behavior getting to the point where you got to watch them more? Each one of those things could be explained away separately, but when they all come together as a pattern, then they need to be investigated a lot further. And the most unsettling part is that it's not just one single mechanism that's causing this to happen. The severe cases end up becoming emotional outliers. They're usually kept in the house, they can't get out. Subtle cases become statistically invisible, so You don't on the outer, the center of the bell curve goes unnoticed. And then so once that happens, almost every debate turns into an argument. Now, and the vaccine manufacturers and the public health organizations don't seem to mind a whole lot about it. But in the broader systemic argument, this is where it becomes bigger than just autism. It links the rise in neurological, allergic, autoimmune, chronic illnesses to three recurring processes. There's an unresolved inflammation that doesn't seem to clear up. Cytokines go out of, are normal or abnormal cytokine reactions. And then there starts to be impaired blood or lymph flow. And the childhood vaccine schedule, as you remember, dramatically expanded from 1983 to 2016. More shots, more total exposures, more vaccines administered at younger ages in tighter clusters. Does that prove that these changes caused autism? No, but it reveals a pattern that needs to be looked at much more deeply. But it's one reason why many people argue that exposure intensity itself deserves far more serious investigation. I know of some families I take care of that vaccinate their kids, but will only do one vaccine at a time. They won't cluster them. Well, this isn't an anti-medicine rant. The question is, can a certain product be harmful or in other cases beneficial at a population scale while still producing rare or subgroup specific harms that institutions just don't want to detect, admit, or study? Now, you can choose to vaccinate and think the system isn't handling this correctly at the same time, but both realities exist. We don't need more statements. We don't need more press releases. We need to redefine subgroups. Regressive versus non-regressive autism. There are those diagnosed with autism that don't seem to be going backwards, but still have autistic behaviors. There's the GI, the gastrointestinal versus the non-gastrointestinal cases. There are the premature infants, the immune reactive children, the mitochondrial or metabolic vulnerability children, the timing of the onset of the symptoms, the total exposure patterns. All these things need to be looked at individually. And so the divide here isn't science versus the parents who are concerned. It's whether or not the science is allowed to follow uncomfortable patterns without having first needing to protect the institutional narrative. And that's how this whole thing developed anyway with Dr. Wakefield. And all of that at the expense of the most valuable, vulnerable asset we have, our children. There's a lifetime of reading of information about this on the internet. I don't know why the news doesn't pick it up that much anymore. Except I know I have a lot of parents and patients in my clinic that don't vaccinate anymore. I didn't tell them not to. In fact, I tell my patients, you can go to my website, forbiddendoctor.com, under education, under podcasts, write in vaccination. There's several podcasts on the subject. And then decide for yourself what you're going to do. I'm asked the question, are some vaccines safer than others? Probably. But does that mean the one that's safer is okay? No, not necessarily. It still poisons the system. Well, we decided to give them vaccines, but we made sure they don't get the ones with mercury. Good. Why don't you see if you can get them the ones that don't have aluminum? Aluminum, why is aluminum a problem? The most toxic element on this planet outside of radioactive uranium, plutonium, radium, all the rest of it, is mercury. Mercury is non-radioactive, but it's the most toxic material in the sense of human biology. The second most toxic material is aluminum. Aluminum has no place whatsoever inside the human body. Why do they stick aluminum in these shots? To shock the body, to shock the system, to force the immune system to recognize something it ordinarily would not recognize because it's dead. It's nothing. Your immune system is constantly on watch for what's happening. So I just want to finish this with this idea of vaccines and autism, is that Dr. Wakefield has been exonerated in court. They finally realized that a lot of the information that was brought against him was drummed up nonsense. He never once said the MMR causes vaccine or autism. Well, he was accused of saying it. But the reputation has still been destroyed, even though in court he's been exonerated. Because they had a group of 12 kids, just to review. 9 of those kids had regressive development, mental development. They started going backwards. They had severe gut issues. And 9 of those 12 all had the MMR shot. What does that mean? Well, until you start taking it apart and really investigating it and setting up real comprehensive studies, it doesn't mean anything. But that's kind of what they said. All they said at the end was, this needs more investigation. That was it. Not only was Dr. Wakefield crucified, there was others with him. All right, that's enough of that. All right, I've got something else I want to get into here. Oh, so the question was, what do we do to enhance our children's immune systems? Boy, we've got some great stuff. Immunoplex, chewable Conjuplex. But I tell my patients, and we have immune packs for adults and immune packs for children, stuff that you need, stuff I take every day. Because every day I come across anywhere from 15 to 20 to 40 people. Every now and then there's 1 or 2 here that I've never seen before. But between us, we've created a community of microbes. And I want my immune system to be able to handle this stuff. Now, your immune system is designed to handle a community of microbes because you're being exposed to them all the time. When I was talking about viruses at the beginning of this long section here, I didn't intend to be this long. I gave you the example of the heavens and the stars and how many stars are out there. And with all the stars in the known universe, you have more viruses in your body than all the known stars in the universe. Trillions upon trillions. Most of them are contributing to your health. 90% of the DNA inside your body isn't even human. There are all these microbes, these trillions of microbes, bacteria, viruses, parasites, molds, archaea, and they thrive inside of us. And when we're healthy, it's because the healthy ones are thriving to keep the sicker ones at bay. And they produce chemical substances that your body needs. You can't escape this stuff. It was once believed that a newborn baby's gut was sterile, coming out of that amniotic sac inside of mama. Now they're finding out that's not necessarily true. Mama's food choices can affect the bacteria that's already growing in that unborn baby's gut. But this is why when a newborn baby emerges from the womb, it needs to go straight to the breast to get that colostrum for the next 2 to 3 days, to get that colostrum into its gut, to seed that gut with the healthiest of bacteria. It's the same with all mammals. That's why we're called mammals, because we have mammary glands. Which are designed to feed our newborn, not just to feed them, but to seed the gut wall with the good bacteria that will be there the rest of their lives, producing good health. All right. I think I've hammered that enough. I want to talk about honey for a minute, because I've been asking some, what's the best sugar and I mean, every one of it. Oh, how do I start this? Every one of us at one time or another, we get interested in some new food item that promises to give us more strength and better health. So people ask me, well, magnesium glycinate, is that the best magnesium? Nascent iodine, isn't that the kind of iodine? I mean, Alex Jones says that's what we should be using. Is Alex Jones a physiologist, a biologist, an endocrinologist? And so the novelty of these kinds of things are always fascinating. And in the process, we may overlook the qualities of one of the oldest foods known to man, honey. Because for thousands of years, honey has topped the list of quick energy and health-giving foods. Yet the average home and the people living in there are poorly informed about the exceptional food value of honey. I mean, how else can you explain the fact that honey consumption per capita in this country is about 1.5 pounds per year? Now, most containers of honey are 2 to 3 pounds. But the average amount of honey the average American eats in 1 year is about 1.5 pounds, with the average amount of sugar being 100 pounds for every man, woman, and child in this country. Our consumption of table sugar, 100 times higher than our consumption of honey. And so the trainer, and I know of a wrestling trainer in this state, who recommends that his athletes keep some honey in their lockers, because he knows what he's talking about. But what he might not know what he's talking is that more than 2,000 years ago, the Greek Olympic athletes trained on honey. They knew that no food gives such a volume of quick energy, and one reason is because honey is the only food item that is almost completely pre-digested. The honeybee has already digested what they're eating to produce the honey. So the honey isn't waiting for digestion. It's been mostly pre-digested, because in about 20 minutes after you consume honey, it's in the bloodstream, ready to spark large volumes of energy. And whenever unusual demands are made on the human system, honey's remembered. In the early stages of the Battle of Britain in World War II, the pilots of the British Spitfires were desperately outnumbered by Hitler's dive bombers. And these pilots had to fly 10 or more missions a day at altitudes as high as 35,000 feet. And the fate of their country depended upon their endurance under these grueling conditions, and therefore liberal amounts of honey were included in their diet. And every time they landed to refuel their planes, they were given honey and water. The expert Swiss alpine climbers learned centuries of experience what honey does for their fitness at higher altitudes. And when they prepare for hazardous expeditions where perfect physical conditioning will often spell the difference between life and death, they train on honey. And of course, you know where I'm going with this. The world's best mountain climbers had tried without success to reach the top of Mount Everest in the Himalayas. Finally, in recent years, who was the first man up there that we know about, besides the Sherpas? Edmund Hillary. He succeeded because he trained heavily on honey. Perhaps there is no other food that has caused, that has so many unusual qualities, proven by experience and research. King Solomon knew about it, because in Proverbs he says, "My son, eat thou honey, for it is good." So some doctors take advantage, as I do, of the fact that honey is pre-digested. And I suggest it as a sugar alternative to my heart patients and for those who are recovering from serious diseases, such as pneumonia. And in sanatoriums and orphanages in Europe, there were controlled experiments that showed all these remarkable results with both sick and healthy children. It was proven to be a regular intake of honey that made such a marked difference in their health and their development. And then honey has been successfully used in infant feeding. A Chicago Children's Hospital has been using honey for years in its formula. And the babies handle it very, very easily. Now, a lot of people will buy these antacids, over the counter now, purple pills and these kinds of things. How many of them know that honey acts in the stomach as a natural alkalizer? Yeah, I was surprised to find this out myself. If you're having serious indigestion, a tablespoon or two of honey will calm it right down. Tests by the U.S. Department of Agriculture has shown that the darker the honey is, the stronger its ability is to calm an acidic stomach. So our nation swallows sleeping pills by the ton, no doubt to the detriment of the health of these people. But unfortunately, not enough people know that in many cases, honey comes as a rescue to the sleeplessness. 2 tablespoons of honey dissolved in hot lemonade, as I've suggested to patients in the past, should be taken just before hitting the hay. 2 tablespoons. And what kind of honey? Unprocessed, unfiltered, local honey. Costs a little bit more money, but it's unprocessed. It hasn't been damaged by heat. There may be a piece of honeycomb floating in there in a couple of places. But 2 tablespoons of that in about 8 ounces of hot lemonade. It gives a feeling of well-being, it relaxes the body, and it induces wholesome, natural sleep. The sleep-inducing qualities of honey was discovered by a French doctor decades ago. It's more than likely that our nation spends more than $100 million a year on laxatives, most of them chemicals and habit-forming, a lot of them very dangerous. People who include honey in their daily diet seem to have no need for laxatives. Honey is a mild, natural laxative. Honey is perhaps the cleanest of foods. Laboratory tests have proven that disease-causing bacteria cannot live in honey. This is one of the reasons that honey is the only ready-to-eat food that doesn't spoil in its natural state and keeps indefinitely. Anybody that has food storage in their home that has honey, you don't have to replace it, just keep it sealed. Honey in jars that were found in ancient Egyptian graves were still edible after 33 centuries. And though honey has been thoroughly researched and analyzed, its known chemical components do not fully account for its impressive contribution to our fitness and health in general, because some feel that honey probably still contains within it some undiscovered health factors. because the vitamin content of honey is very small. Whereas vegetables and fruits lose a great deal of their vitamins on the way from the time they're picked to the time they end up in a salad on your table. Honey keeps its modest amount of vitamins well. Honey is a source of minerals. It's essential for good health, even though its contents are small. But then a lot of the minerals that come through in honey, you don't need much of anyway. Up to a dozen different minerals have been found in honey. And curiously enough, the dark, almost where you can't see through it, honey, are by far the richest in minerals. And then another interesting thing about honey is its use in first aid. For burns, immediately covered with honey, it won't blister and it heals faster. Native doctors in Central America who had never heard of asepsis would cover the wounds of their patients with honey. And reportedly, that would prevent infection that way. In fact, with some doctors in Central Europe, honey has regained its place as a surgical dressing, which is not too surprising since the dawn of civilization. Honey has had a great reputation as medicine. I mean, it's an ingredient in almost all prescriptions of the ancient Egyptians. It's right there on their walls. The Bible mentions honey as a medicine. In the Quran, it says honey is a remedy for all diseases. And the symbol of medical science, you got the snake symbol of Asclepius, the god of medicine coiled around a staff, ready to feed from a cup of honey. And then 16 centuries ago, St. Ambrose said, honey cures their wounds and conveys remedies to inward ulcers. And so with all of the stuff you can go get in the pharmacy of the supermarket, and all the stuff you can order online, honey has been largely forgotten by modern medics, but still, most of us are familiar with first-hand reports that honey benefited somebody suffering from stomach trouble or arthritis or persistent coughs. And then recent experiments by the New York Department of Agriculture brought to light that honey performs miracles as a sober upper. Interestingly enough, a few tablespoons of honey dissolved in a glass of warm water restored the intoxicated to sobriety in about 30 minutes. And since antiquity, the conviction that honey in the diet assures longevity has persisted. A belief like this can't be easily proven by any means, but the Greek philosophers ate quantities of honey. Pythagoras died at 90. His apostle Apollonius lived to be 113. Anacreon gave credit for his long life. He died at 115 to honey. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, was a honey enthusiast and recommended it for a long life. Democritus, who explained the principle of the atom 23 centuries ago, gave his health qualities from honey. At 109, he felt he had lived long enough and brought about his death by fasting. Then there is Pios, the beekeeper, who became the first king of Poland in 824 AD, lived to be 120. And since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes were much in the news. They were an ancient Hebrew sect, as you know, but their longevity was proverbial, and they were beekeepers. And in modern times, as well, there are indications that honey in the diet may be related to the long life of a lot of people. Several famous beekeepers have lived to a ripe old age. I have a list of them here, but I'm not going to go into it because we're coming up to the end of the program. There is more I can say about honey, but when you're buying it, you need to get raw honey. Not pasteurized, not processed. It needs to be raw. Or get it from a beekeeper. But the light-colored ones that comes from clover may have a better eye appeal, but the dark honey is the one that has the best food value. So I hope that answers the question. And there's just not enough that can be possibly said about honey as this incredible boost to the human system that it provides. But one of the best things about it is pre-digested. The bees' digestive system has already digested this stuff to a large degree so that within 20 minutes, a good dose of honey is in your bloodstream, giving you all the energy that you might require for that half marathon. Anyway, my half special is still going on. As I said, I got four new patients today. All four of them coming in because of the half special. You need to make an appointment by calling 801-523-1890. And we'll sit down for, as long as it takes for me to be able to explain what's going on and how I can relate what I do to the symptoms you're having. If your symptoms are outside of my scope of practice, I'll let you know. I might have a referral or two for you if I don't think I can help you. But we're able to help most of the people coming through. And one of the most dramatic cases I mentioned at the beginning of the show was this 89-year-old lady that came in all hunched over and walked out anywhere from 75 to 80% straighter. And she just had this big smile on her face, like, how did you do that? Well, you know how to do it. It's not that hard. All right. More information about what I do at jackstockwell.com. Finally got the stream back up, so this is going to be on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com/breaking health barriers. And I'm going to end the recording right now and save that. For those of you who are on the stream, I appreciate you being well, some of you actually were there. The numbers used to be a lot higher, but I haven't been streaming for almost a month. But I got the problem fixed last night, finally found out what it was. And then, so I'll be back Monday. I'm going to end the stream. And if you can like and share and subscribe and all that stuff. And we're over 900. We have over 900 subscribers now to the health show. I really appreciate your being a part of that.